Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining today. My name is Patty First. I am a founding principal at the Raben Group. We're a nationwide public affairs and public policy firm with offices in several parts of the country, although now all remote. So I'm so glad that you could join us today for this discussion. To say that COVID-19 has upended our lives would be a massive understatement. This is especially true, I think, for our work lives, as we all learn the glories and the pitfalls of Zoom, not to mention our kids' online learning platforms. So many of us are home, and we are trying to learn all of these new things, and we're trying to figure out how do we lead people during this time. And we're so excited today to have 5 people who can help us to figure out how we lead more mindfully, how we build resilience in our own organizations. And the great news is that they have all been doing it since before COVID. So there's a lot we can learn from them. I'm excited for this conversation today, and I want to get to it. I am going to introduce Michele Palmer, who is the executive director of the Wendt Center. She's wonderful. And Michele, I have just been kicked out of my notes on my Google document. So I'm going to let you introduce yourself and give your bio. I'm going to say, though, that Michele is a wonderful leader that we have worked with many times at the Raben Group. And she is a specialist in trauma and grief, and the Wendt Center does really just amazing work with people who have experienced deep trauma and grief. So Michele, I'm going to let you introduce yourself, but I want to ask you, in this particular time, can you just kind of center us in like where we're at right now? And the kinds of things that organizations should be doing to how they should be thinking about resilience in their own organization, and how they should be thinking about resilience with their own people, and why that's important right now.
Sure, thanks. Hi, I'm Michele. As Patty said, I'm the executive director of an agency in Washington, D.C. called the Wendt Center for Loss and Healing. We are a mental health agency that specializes in grief and trauma. I myself am a grief and trauma therapist. I'm a clinical social worker by education, and if you ask my mom, probably by birth. So, boy, there's a lot to think about for today. Let me tell you first that, as Patty said, this is something that I've been doing long before COVID. The nature of the work of the Wendt Center is that essentially I am asking therapists to spend 6 or 8 hours a day listening to the very worst moments of people's lives. And so my job is to make sure that they can do that and show up for that sort of with their most full selves, so that they can help the clients that we have committed to serve be able to be vulnerable enough to be able to walk through whatever it is that's brought them to the agency, and get through it to whatever other side that is. So let me first say that where we are right now, really a lot of people are talking about, is a collective bereavement experience. We are grieving things like death from COVID. We're grieving things like death from other causes, because life and death don't stop in this pandemic. We're grieving things like, spring passages like prom and graduation, first communion, if that's what you happen to celebrate. And then we're grieving everyday things like being able to be with friends and family physically, being able to hug someone that we care about, being able to shake hands with someone. So there are a lot of things that we are navigating the loss of. It becomes really important. I want to sort of set that context because I think it is important when we think about how do we as leaders lead? How is it that we are building resilience for our staff during this time and frankly beyond? I brought a prop. It's a rubber band. And really the way that I think about resilience is how stretched can your rubber band get before it actually breaks? So if you think about this pandemic, I want you to think about what did your rubber band look like going into this pandemic? Was your rubber band already like this? Or was it like this? Or was it like this? Because if it was already stretched, there's not a whole lot of bandwidth here. And so you're really going to figure out strategies to help get your emotional bandwidth more like this so that there's some more flexibility in there. You also want to think about that same thing for your staff. What was their emotional rubber band like going into this? We all know that when our emotional rubber band, our bandwidth is stretched, we are not our best selves. We don't do our best thinking. We typically over respond to things and frankly, oftentimes underperform. And so now is really an important time to think about grace. You want to give folks grace. Many people are probably not performing at their optimum, but you also don't want to stop having accountability. So it really is about thinking about how do you approach your staff, frankly, and yourself with compassionate accountability that says to folks, I believe in you. I know that we've got what we need to navigate this. So I'm going to give some grace and I'm not going to stop expecting things from you. And so when I think about that, some of the real concrete things I think about is, are there projects that you can tell your team, you know what, let's put that on the shelf. It can sit for a little while. It doesn't actually need our attention or add pressure to sort of what we already have going on. What are the projects that we can lift the foot off the gas a little bit and give ourselves a little bit of room, continue to work on them, but perhaps with a little bit less urgency? And what are the things that need to be tended to right now? What is the stuff that we have to keep our eye on the ball? We have to keep our foot on the pedal. So those are really the things that I would say within this collective bereavement and trauma experience. We really want to be thinking about how do you make the work more manageable so that people can show up sort of as their best selves within the context of trying to operate in the midst of a crisis.
Thank you, Michele. That was fantastic. And I love the rubber band analogy. And we'll be thinking about that daily. So thank you for that. All right, we're going to be back to you in a little bit. But first, I wanted to introduce Chris Bright. Chris is the director of public training at the Trevor Project. And the Trevor Project is the world's largest suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for LGBTQ youth. Each year, they travel the country providing life-saving and life-affirming training for youth-serving professionals. Chris works to educate corporations, municipalities, organizations on LGBTQ competent suicide prevention and is working this year on a video series that's aimed at peer-to-peer support for high school and college-age youth. So Chris, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yes, absolutely. So Chris, the work that the Trevor Project does to educate and prevent LGBTQ suicide is so important. And I would imagine can sometimes be really harrowing for your staff, because I know that you all do both actual support for youth and you do education. So what does the Trevor Project do as an organization to take care of your staff and to increase their resilience? And then how do you extend that into your own work with the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, when you think about the unprecedented times that we're in right now with COVID-19, the impact that that's having globally, but every organization is feeling right now. Um, the things that the Trevor Project did early on to support our staff and to promote resilience were things that we had already had in place, and it allowed us to sort of mobilize fairly quickly when we needed to in light of everything that's been going on. So early on, we paused business travel, we closed our offices, and we worked really hard to take our call centers fully remote. Um, and while our digital counselors have always been remote. Our Lifeline counselors have always had physical call centers. And so you can imagine that that was a huge undertaking to be able to get our crisis services for telephone-based, like phone-based communication remote. And we were able to do that in a safe way that focused and prioritized our youth as well as our team members. We also work really hard to create a culture where we stay connected to one another, which is so important right now. We receive regular team-wide updates from the organization via email, sort of all hands on deck. And I don't know if any other orgs out there are using Slack, but we love Slack. It's a great way, especially in the time of COVID-19, to stay connected to people, even when everybody is working remotely. We also created special Slack channels that gave opportunities to connect. I know this sounds like an ad for Slack. There are plenty of things out there that you can get connected to. We just happen to use that platform. But by creating those channels, we have like remote coffee dates, and we have a book club now, and all these things that allow us to stay connected, because we know that self-care is so important to promoting resiliency within the org. We also partnered with Headspace. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Headspace. It's a mindfulness and meditation app. And they were able to provide all full-time, part-time staff free accounts, which is super, super helpful, and has given us the opportunity to focus on mindfulness in a time when things can be pretty stressful. I also want to just sort of highlight that our staff members are balancing a lot right now. Of course, everybody is. And because it's really important that they take time for themselves, we gave all Trevor employees, full-time or part-time, an additional like personal day that they could take away. I know that not everyone is in the position to be able to do that, but giving that additional personal day allows people to sort of budget their, let's say, metaphorical cup. And when it's running a little bit low, they could say, you know what? I'm going to take a personal day. I'm going to maybe watch some Netflix, maybe do some mindfulness, maybe just have some me time and bake, but whatever they need to do where they don't need to worry about work and they don't have to be in that headspace. Because when you're in the work of crisis intervention and suicide prevention, as we are, that's very intense work, and we need to make sure that people have time for themselves. Also, I'll highlight that we encourage staff to use the health benefits that we offer. Teletherapy is a new thing for a lot of people that they've never experienced before. But having those teletherapy resources, I think for a lot of people has been super beneficial. And our people ops team, and I think a lot of orgs should be doing something similar to this. Our people ops team announced that they're going to hold weekly office hours where staff can just connect with them and say, hey, I'm going to drop in on this office hour. I'm going to hold this time on your calendar because I want to talk about either what's going on in my own life. I have questions about what's happening in the org. And it helps really set the tone for accessibility and making sure that your voice is heard, making sure that people know what you need, because we've never been in a time like this before. And then I'll wrap up with all of that filters into our programs. So everything that we're doing for our staff to take care of our staff allows us to continue our best-in-class service for young people who are reaching out when they are in need, when they need support, and we are still there for them. And we're really, really proud to be able to be that kind of an org for them.
That is really, really cool. And I would imagine also you're able to, when you're taking care of yourself, you're then better able to help people, right? Because you've got the resiliency in yourself and resources to be able to do it. So thank you for that, Chris. All right, we're going to be back to you also in a minute. I did want to say, for those of you watching this online, if you go to the live comments section, if you have questions, we are going to have Q&A later. So please add your questions or comments in there, and we'll have the panelists address them in a little bit. So thank you for doing that. Also, I just want to note, you may have noticed that we have 2 Chris's and 2 Michelles. It is true. This panel. And we decided to, spice that up in the middle with a non-Chris or Michele. So I want to introduce Kimi Jackson, who is the director of the American Bar Association's South Texas Pro Bono Asylum Representation Project, which is known as ProBar. They're located in Harlingen, Texas, and ProBar serves adults and unaccompanied children who are facing deportation proceedings. Before becoming director, Kimi served as the managing attorney for ProBar's children's project, so she's been there a long time. ProBar is located near the Texas-Mexico border and the Gulf of Mexico, and it's in an area of really high concentration of immigration detention facilities. So welcome, Kimi. How are you?
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and part of this really important topic.
Yeah, thank you for being here. So I know that ProBar's attorneys are in court every day, or were in court every day, now virtually, helping immigrants, often children, navigate detention and our country's increasingly challenging immigration policies. Some of those cases are very heartbreaking, but I know that your staff feels a real sense of shared community, and that ProBar's made it a priority, and you've made it a priority as executive director to encourage their own self-care, but that a lot of the ways that happened pre-COVID was to be in community with each other. And so one of my questions for you is, can you tell us about how you're adapting and what ProBar is doing for its staff and to keep that resilience going since COVID-19?
Sure. Well, my guiding principle really hasn't changed, and that is that I know that my team is my number one resource. Our staff are our number one resource because we provide services, and without our staff, we can't do that. So I need to treat them accordingly, and that doesn't mean that I don't discipline people or terminate people unfortunately, if I need to, but that everything that I do is for the best interest of my team as a whole, and from a genuine place. So a couple of years ago, we experienced the family separation crisis, where immigrant families were being separated. And my team was on the front line of that, meeting with children who had just been separated from a parent. And that was obviously very traumatic for them. So I met with them as a group with my team, and I asked them 3 questions. What are you experiencing? How is it impacting you? And what can we as an organization do to help you, to support you through this? And I listened to them, and I delivered on as many of their requests as I could. And one thing that came out of that was something called self-care time. And we give each staff member 4 hours a month that that's paid time for them to engage in a self-care activity of their choice. And another thing that the idea behind that is that self-care, taking time for self-care, is part of your job. So you've got to take those at least 4 hours a month. Another thing we began to do is provide healthy snacks in the office. People love when we provide fresh fruit. I got people posting on social media, "My work takes care of me," and pictures of our fruit baskets. They loved it. We had a ping pong tournament in the office on a ping pong table that we have there. And we contracted a counselor to provide debriefing sessions for our staff to help them process the trauma that they were experiencing. So basically, the most important thing was that I needed to show my team that I had their back, that I couldn't change the situation that they were experiencing, but that I would do everything that I could to support them in doing their jobs. So how to translate this to the new abnormal? I mean, obviously we're still figuring this out, but I think we can apply the same principles. So I held a session with staff asking, how are you feeling? What, how is this impacting you? And I heard, for example, one staff member said that her 5-year-old son wanted to climb up on her lap during Zoom calls, and she was afraid that she might get in trouble if her son would appear during one of the calls. And so, of course, I assured her that, hey, if we're all in this situation, we all could have kids or pets climb in our lap at any given time, and that's okay. We're understanding about that right now. These are not normal circumstances. We also instituted virtual coffee breaks, like Chris mentioned. We celebrate our team wins at Zoom meetings. We're going to have our first virtual work anniversary party later this week, and we're working on setting up some time to do game playing, which can be done via various platforms such as Zoom and others. And then the counselor who we already had on contract, she has been really helpful in conducting debriefing sessions on dealing with the current situation and helping people move through the feelings that they're having throughout this. So I think overall, the most important thing is to be honest with the team, to keep them informed of what's happening, even when we don't know all the answers, to listen to them, and then to make decisions with their best interest in mind. And they see that happening. For example, how we responded to the pandemic. We also went remote before we were required to do so. We prioritized the safety of our staff as well as our clients. And we received a lot of words of appreciation for that. So it really comes down to my original principle, knowing that my team is my #1 resource, that I need to sustain them and therefore treat them accordingly.
That's really, really great. Thank you, Kimi. That's fabulous. And I love how you have adapted. All right, so we'll come back to you as well for some questions in a bit. But I wanted to introduce next Michele Jarmon, who is the People Operations Manager for Namely.com. And Namely.com is an online HR platform that helps companies with all things HR and staffing. At Namely, Michele is very focused on diversity and gender equity. And Michele, I wanted to talk with you about, I know Namely.com helps companies to build better workplaces through, among other things, your HR platform. So what trends, because you work with so many different companies and so many different organizations, are there trends that you're seeing in HR, including maybe things that Namely is doing in terms of creating resilience and fostering organizational health during this pandemic?
Thanks, Patty. That's a great question. And thank you for including me in the conversation today. As far as identifying trends, there are multiple industries that we support within Namely. So we are seeing a lot of requests for management of COVID-19 under the CARES Act, regulations that are constantly changing, really looking for ways to engage more virtually with their with their employee bases. And so Namely itself, we also have a really strong culture of communication. We use a lot of the tools that have already been mentioned, but like Slack, telemedicine, mindfulness apps and programs. And so Namely has a blog that we utilize for our clients, and we really support them with not only compliance support, especially with everything changing so rapidly, but we also give them ideas that we're utilizing within our organization and tools and tips and tricks to help with employees who may be first-time virtual managers, first-time managing remotely in circumstances, looking for opportunities to review their benefits and look for those flexible options that may be more cost-effective for their organizations if they're smaller. So we are starting to see a lot of trends with those types of questions. And so we've been fortunate to have a really strong content team that works to answer all of those questions and kind of pull together best practices for all of our clients.
That's really great. And I'd love to hear a little bit more about some of those best practices in just a second. But in the meantime, before we get there, I want to make sure we get to Chris Kocher, who, hi, Chris. Good. Who is the Senior Director of the Everytown Survivor Network, which is a program of Everytown for gun safety. The Everytown Survivor Network is a nationwide community of thousands of gun violence survivors who are working together to end gun violence. And the Survivor Network connects survivors to each other and amplifies the power of their voices, and offers trauma-informed programs and information on direct services and supports survivors who choose to become advocates. So, Chris, there are few people in this world, I think, who have probably had their resilience tested more than survivors of gun violence. And my initial question for you is, what have you learned from them? And how does that infuse your work at Everytown?
Sure. Thank you so much for having this conversation and inviting me to be part of it. I think, the thing that I have learned that I sort of take through all this, and I'll talk about some specifics in a second, but, the idea that resiliency and hope and grief and happiness and sadness and these things that we think of as sort of opposite emotions can exist, at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think that, finding purpose and being part of change is sort of resiliency armor. So being intentional about the things that you are part of and the way that you, are looking to make change, whether it's in the world or in your family, with your friends, in your own life, those can really be instrumental in helping people build resiliency. Some of the things that I've learned, I think, are, knowing what you know and know what you don't know, and don't be afraid of either of those things. My background is as an attorney. And so when I first started, launched this work several years ago, I knew about messaging and I knew about policy and I knew about gun laws, but I didn't know about trauma. I didn't know about grief. I'm not a survivor myself. And so that meant that it was really important that I listened to people, that I asked questions, that I solicited advice, opinions, feedback constantly, so that we were constantly course correcting and meeting people where they wanted us to be. As we, developed additional programming and really started to understand more about trauma, building partnerships with outside organizations to help people get access to counseling, because that was not something that we had, the expertise that we had inside the organization. And in this moment, working with people to share their stories, how to help them and empower them to share their stories virtually. That's something that obviously, we're all learning as we go through. Know what you can control and what you can't control. So we often talk about this on my team as, what is in your power as an individual? What do you have license over? What do you collectively have license over together as a team? And then what can the organization do? And I think those are all really, really important things. And we all have a role in each of those things. And so regardless of what your organization is going to do or not do, regardless of what your team is going to do or not do, there are things that you can do and control in your own life as an employee, as a volunteer, as an activist, that you can be intentional about what you have the license to change in your own life. I think especially in this time, showing vulnerability and modeling vulnerability. So I have a first grader that I'm trying to homeschool, and I have a 14-month-old. Right. So depending on, I'm in the kitchen now because I live in New York City. Right. So I have a 2-bedroom apartment. So my daughter is napping in our bedroom, which is where I would normally take calls from. So being very open about that. My daughter has also, my first grader has also appeared on frequent work calls. I keep an open calendar so my team can see what my meetings are. And because both myself and my partner are both working full time, that I have, take time on my calendar where I'm not, where I'm not able to be working. So I'm very intentional, very open about when those times are, and, empowering my colleagues to do the same if they need that. And then, if I'm in a meeting where, I don't need to be looking at a document, for example, I've asked, colleagues on the call, is it okay? I know this is our weekly check-in. Is it okay if I take this while I'm walking? because that's really important for my self-care. I think doing what's easy, quote unquote easy, nothing's really easy in this moment, but doing what's low-hanging fruit. There's obviously like 100 things that we all can be doing. And if you think about those 100 things, that can sometimes be overwhelming or frustrating or challenging. But pick one thing that you can do, pick 2 things, pick 3 things. Like someone said earlier, pick the thing that you were going to be doing already, that you had in the works, and use it in this moment to launch. So some of the things that we've done are, weekly check-ins with the team where we don't have a working agenda. We're just talking to each other about each other's self-care. We build self-care into a standing part of weekly check-in agendas that I have both with my boss, my supervisor, and with my direct reports. We also are big fans of Slack, and we actually at work have a new normal Slack where we have done conversations about self-care, but also posting silly photos of each other, of ourselves from the 80s and the 90s and different decades. So things like that, and of course like Headspace and some of the other applications that people have talked about. Accountability buddies, we call it, that we borrowed from another organization, having one person that you are accountable on those self-care practices. And naming that it's okay for people to step away, whether it's because they need to focus on self-care or they need to take care of children or older relatives who may be sick. And then finally, and this is a simple thing, but I can't stress it enough, which is just ask questions and listen. And this goes back to sort of knowing what you know and don't know. But there's talking to a group of people will almost always know more than any one person does. And so this means talking to, a groups of people, talking to a bunch of people one-on-one and collecting what has worked and what has not worked, and what they are looking for, and what they want to see from the organization, and from each other. And that will sort of always that collective information, I think, will always help you get to a better place than you just thinking through on your own.
That term accountability buddies is fantastic.
I can't claim full credit for it. We definitely borrowed it from another organization. But
That's
yeah, we
great.
love it.
Thank you. All right, I think we're going to bring everybody back up, and so you're going to see all of us at once. If you have questions or comments, please add them in the live comments section. Please type them right in. And we'll get to those in just a second. I did want to ask all of you, I'm thinking of this kind of at 2 levels, right? You've got, I think, probably organizational leaders who don't exactly know how to lead during this time, right? Because it's not like any of us have been trained to lead during a pandemic. I think there's probably leaders out there who are wondering, how do I actually do this? Like, what are the first steps that I take to kind of start creating a more resilient organization? And then a lot of what we've been talking about, and then on the flip side of that is a lot of what we've been talking about is really based in workplace culture. And if you're in a workplace that does not have a culture of resilience, I think there are probably other people out there watching this who are thinking, okay, well, this is great, but how do I get my own organization to adopt some of these things? So I'd love to have you all kind of address whichever side of that question you'd like, whether it's kind of what do you do as a leader in this moment? And the flip side of that, which is if your organization does not have a culture of resilience, how do you start to create one? How do you convince people to create one? So whoever wants to take it first.
I can comment on the second question. I'm the director of a local organization that has about 180 staff, and then we're a project of the American Bar Association, which has its own culture that's really different. And we've been in crisis for a few years now as an immigration service provider at the border, giving everything that's happened. So I guess it's been helpful to me during this time to have already been accustomed to working in crisis mode. But needed to make arguments to the larger organization about how taking some of these self-care measures is in the economic best interest of our organization. We spend a lot of money trying to hire. We are located in an area that is more rural, and we're growing rapidly. So we spend a lot of money recruiting, hiring, training up new people. So retaining staff is critical. So I made those economic and business purpose arguments to the parent organization, and that led to more support for the measures that I was wanting to take.
That's great. Yeah, and really important, right? Because, a lot of these measures do cost money. But there was actually, but payoff. And we'll get in a little bit to a question about productivity that I think gets to that too. But does anybody else want to address the two questions that I posed?
I can go. So what's interesting right now is because nobody knows what they're doing, leaders are required to make decisions that they believe are best based on what science is saying, what the best information is saying. I get that, but sometimes you have to make hard decisions and do it because you know that it's going to be for the well-being of your staff. So I'll give you an example at Trevor. We have no idea when this is going to be over, but it can be pretty anxiety producing to be like, am I going back to my office next week? Some states are talking about opening up, right now. When are we all going to be back in that space together? And when we are back in that space, will it be safe? We have an office in New York City, and many of my colleagues have left New York City, maybe to go stay with their family or friends because of what's happening in New York City right now. And so just this week, Amit, who's the CEO at the Trevor Project, Amit Paley, announced that we are not going to be going back to the office until September at the earliest. And a lot of people might be like, wow, that's pretty extreme. We have no idea when we'll be going back. But what that does for staff is it lets everybody be like, okay, now I know to plan my summer from the perspective of I'm going to be working from home. And maybe not everyone is in the position to make plans like that, but I think that is something where you have a leader saying, here's the decision we're making. It's going to be maybe different than what some governments or some states are doing, but we're doing it because we believe that's what's best for everybody. And I think that's an interesting question to pose, because sometimes leaders are going to have to do what's different than the leadership of the country or the leadership of their state, because they know what's best for their staff.
Yeah. Yes, that's great. And I think, Kimi, that goes to what you were saying earlier as well, that's your first priority is how your staff is doing. Yeah. Anybody else have a comment on that? Otherwise, we can go to some of these questions.
The only thing I would add to that is just, I think, to say that everyone, does have, speaking of children Zoom bombing, but thinking that we there is the organization, and we've also made some of the similar economic arguments. We have, for example, a very low turnover on my team because I think of always prioritizing that. But I think thinking that as a team we have license to do certain things, and as individuals we have license to do certain things, and that's not it's not a panacea. It doesn't solve all the needs, but I think really empowering yourself and the people that you work with, whether it's a team or a department or a division, or even just a colleague, to do things differently. I think sometimes just by doing, sometimes you set an example of leadership at a junior level of the organization.
That's great. Thank you. So I had a question about, and then we're going to go to some of these live questions for you, Michele, about the rubber band analogy that you used. What do you do when people on your team are differently stretched?
So I think the first thing is actually to recognize that they're differently stretched. And then to have a conversation with them about what you noticed, to check. The thing that runs in my head as a leader is two things, transparency and curiosity. It sort of gets to that whole, how do you lead through this? I'm super transparent. I don't know what I'm doing a lot of the time, and I mess up a lot of the time, and my team knows it, because the other part of that is I model how we fix things. I don't want my agency to be perfect. It's not going to be perfect, and that expectation is too much. Around curiosity, if I notice that, your rubber band is here, first of all, am I right? And okay, so now we know that. No judgment. What is it that we need to do so that you're able to show up your best self when your rubber band is this? Because I think as leaders, we have a tendency to want to fix that. There are so many things that stretch people's rubber band that is so far out of our capacity as leaders, and frankly, what we should be doing as leaders. And so helping people think through for themselves how to best problem solve this particular moment in time. And that's what this is. This is a moment in time, so that they can move through it and get back to wherever it is. This is important, though, this whole emotional bandwidth issue, just to be seen, just to help your team know that they are seen, is incredibly powerful. And I'm not just saying that because I'm a therapist, I promise.
Although that's okay. If you that gives you even more credibility to say it to us. So thank you. Thanks for that, Michele. Elizabeth, you want to bring up a couple of the questions we had? I know we had some really good ones. So Aaron's asking, have you seen a change in productivity? If so, how do you address it? I think that question could go either way, right? If you see a change in productivity kind of during the pandemic, if people are less productive, like how do you address that? But then also, do you see changes in productivity after people have started doing some of these resilience-based measures that we've been talking about? Who wants to start with that one? Anybody?
I can definitely take the first part of that question. Recognizing the change in productivity, I think it comes from all of the vulnerability and awareness, and as a leader, recognizing that, but also being vulnerable in that space with your team and your peers. And, I understand we're blocked in this moment. How do we help navigate around that? How do we reach out to our employee resource groups and affinity groups to help support either a decline of productivity or set ourselves up to address that there are going to be those same hours during the day where you hit a wall? Is that the time where you engage and plan to work around that, with the knowing the uncertainty kind of contributes to anxiety for everyone? I think those are the moments where you get to support and advocate for one another as peers as well, and lead from a group perspective.
Yeah. And I would imagine this goes back to a lot of what all of you have been saying about doing things like the easiest things first. And, Michele, what you were saying about figuring out, like, what are the things that maybe we don't need to do right now? Because I know when we're under this much stress and when we're dealing with this much kind of collective grief, it is much, much harder to be productive, because that's how our brains are designed, right? They're designed to like shut down that productivity so that all of that energy can go to dealing with the stress and the collective grief. So anybody else have thoughts on this particular question?
Yeah, the other thing that I would add is that, for the most part, that we are, we're not strangers. Your colleagues are not strangers to you. So you have a pre-existing relationship and pre-existing dynamics. And so even though we are in this new normal, in this new, unprecedented time, you have a history of working with the person, and you probably have been through in the past. They've gone through things in their personal life, or you have, and you work through that. So remembering that, and so thinking about, well, is it, a quick check-in, 15 minutes, first thing in the morning, is that really what will help ground that person and center them for the day, or will that overwhelm them? And it will feel like you're micromanaging them, right? Those are one strategy that could have two completely opposite reactions. And so just remembering that, like, a little bit about, how the person works and how they respond. And so draw on that history and those existing dynamics, for, someone who, is really hard on themselves, being really, like you said, letting them be heard and seen, and being explicit with that permission. I know how hard you are on yourself always. And this is different. And, and especially now, I want you to make sure that you are taking the time to take care of yourself, or be with your kids or your family, or whatever it is that you need in this moment. And then also, like, setting the priorities. I know that we talked about these 10 things before all this happened. Here are the 3 things that are still a top priority in this moment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. I know we have a couple of really good questions from Mary. You want to pull those up, Elizabeth? Okay, so Mary says, given the uncertain times with more than 30 million people losing their jobs in recent weeks, how do you assure your employees when there's a real risk even more people will lose jobs? So, how do you actually have this kind of resilient culture and this, culture that prioritizes self-care when you don't know what's going to happen with the economy, and you might need to let people go? Anybody have thoughts on that?
I can jump in. So, one of the things that grieving and traumatized people most need is predictability. Mm-hmm. And so for us, even though we don't know what's going to happen, what we can let our folks know is, I don't know what this is going to look like. What I can promise you is that it will never come out of left field for anybody. And so it will likely look like X, Y, and Z, so that people, it's not going to settle. You're not going to settle deep anxiety about losing one's job. It's simply not possible. But if you can help alleviate a little bit of it by helping them understand that it is not just going to blindside them, you really will help tamper a little bit of that suffering.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I would imagine that a lot of that involves just transparency. Yeah. Anybody else have thoughts on Mary's question? Wants to jump in?
The only thing I would add is that I think if, every organization, is in a different financial circumstance, and obviously there's so much uncertainty, but even if you can say, well, we're good for the next 2 months, or we're good for 2020, or, this is the point when we're going to revisit that question. But if you can take it off the table for any amount of time for people, I think that would be helpful as well.
Excellent. Thank you. So Mary had another great question about working from home. Do you think working from home will become easily embraced when we return to the new normal? Do you think this change that was forced on us by COVID-19 will be something we embrace when we're on the other side? Whenever that is.
It's a super interesting question, because you would have to be honest and acknowledge that there are some positive things coming out of work from home for some people. Maybe not for everybody, but for some people. So things like Los Angeles, the traffic capital of the world, you can get on the freeway without traffic any time of the day, any day of the week right now. There's no traffic, right? The air quality is better because people are not commuting and polluting as often. There are things like that are happening. Also, for some parents who are raising very young children, it's giving them more opportunity to spend time with those children, or to be there with their family. So there are certain benefits that are happening, and I think that exists. There's also maybe a business proposition here. Rent is very expensive. And if some businesses could save money by having more employees work from home, or reduce the size of their offices because they have more positions that can work from home, there are all those things that exist. But there's also those unseen costs that make this question a little difficult to answer right now, which is, are relationships and collaboration suffering? Are we not as collaborative as organizations right now because we are not in the same room as one another and we can't just go over and tap each other on the shoulder and say, hey, I have a question. And so that is all unseen. And I think what will end up happening is there will be pros and there will be cons, and we end up having to weigh those two things when things return to normal. And because it seems like that could be for a long time, I think we have a little bit of time to start asking that question down the road and saying, what is the real outcome of this, and will this change things going forward?
Well, I'm going to be really interested to see if I have a theory that it's the resilient organizations, like the organizations that kind of have some of this resilient workplace culture built in, and maybe are a little more adaptable, including adaptable to working from home or adaptable to figuring out how to do their work, that are going to be the ones that have the easier time and perhaps more productivity, to go back to Erin's question, because that's baked into the organizational culture already. But we'll see.
I would really like to see a hybrid model where, in the future, we could have staff who wanted to have the flexibility to work from home during part of the week or certain days or whatever. And it would help with certain employees would like that a lot. And also it would help us with the office space issue, as was mentioned, which is has been difficult as we've grown rapidly to find enough space for everyone. So it could alleviate that, and I think be a win-win.
Yeah, yeah. I know that I think it was Claudia had a very specific question for Kimi about EAP, that they have an employee assistance program that's available. So she was wondering if the contractor, I think the counselor that you were talking about, Kimi, if that is in addition to your employee assistance program.
Yes, it is. And we started it because we were aiming to help address the vicarious trauma that our staff was experiencing. So we wanted to provide a group debriefing session for them. But in the current situation, it's become really helpful. And I think the reality is that different people respond to different things. So certain staff are going to be really happy to go talk individually to a counselor through EAP, and others might enjoy a group session where we recognize some of the things we're all experiencing together. And both services are optional. We don't force anybody to do it. So I think I think there's a benefit to having both available if you're able to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's great. Thank you. All right, Elliot has a question. Michelle's rubber band analogy was outstanding. How can organizations lessen internal tension, which unfortunately is probably tougher or toughest to do during a stressful time? And this is probably going to be our last question because we're getting close to the top of the hour. What do you all think about Elliot's question? How do we lessen that internal tension? I know you talked about it a little bit, Michele, in terms of when I asked about people with differently stretched rubber bands. But, what about other internal tensions? Everyone right now, well, not everyone, but a lot of people right now are kind of leading with their vulnerabilities, because that's what we do when we're stressed, which I would imagine can create additional internal tension. And when we're all remote, how do you really surface those tensions and manage through them and deal with them? Any thoughts?
Well, you did mention the rubber band analogy. I love, because one thing that it also highlights is that if everybody is operating at maximum tension, then when a crisis happens, an organization can't flex into that. So I know we're in the middle of a crisis, so it's sort of like shoulda, coulda, woulda at this point. Like you needed to make sure that before COVID-19 happened, you had some slack in the system, right? But I think it's a good lesson learned that if we're running out there saying for our teams, you have to be 100% productive all the time, you have to be able to be the most efficient machine you can possibly be, then what you're doing is you're setting yourself up for failure when a crisis happens, because now there's no slack in your system and there's no space for people to lose productivity or to maybe have a down day or a day that's not great. And so you need to build in policies and procedures within your org that say, we value sick time, we value paid time off, we have enough team members so that a team can go without 2 or 3 people for extended periods of time if they need to. And you build all those redundancies in so that you can handle the really stressful time. What this answer doesn't help, though, is if you're like, well, we didn't really build in that slack before COVID-19, and now we're really struggling. And I get that, and I know that that can be disappointing, but we learn from things, and this could be an opportunity for orgs to learn, like, wow, I actually need to build in some like tension release into those rubber bands.
And to piggyback off of Chris's feedback, those organizations that are already set up for success with flexing in this space, it was really helpful, I think, even looking at Namely as an example, to have all of those benefits, those programs reiterated, talking about all of your EAP, your telemed offerings, your teletherapy offerings, also creating spaces where, as groups, you know, either individually or collectively as an organization, we have weekly stretching and meditation sessions. So there are those spaces where you can be vulnerable together and not worry about any stigma surrounding how you may be feeling or feeling isolated in those spaces. It's already baked into every day and every week. And therefore our employees always know there's a space for them. And it also leans back into affinity groups and employee resource groups, you know, creating those spaces where you may not feel comfortable being that vulnerable with your team in this space, but you may feel more comfortable in after hour trivia where you can kind of have a free space and not feel as though you're taking time away from your productivity and contributing to your anxieties, with video conferences and that oversaturation of the virtual engagement.
Yeah, and actually along those lines, there was a really, I know I said it was the last question, but there was a really important question that just popped up that I think goes along with exactly what you were saying, Michele, which Kimberly's asking, with today's current working from home situation, how do you address anxiety issues with employees participating on video conferences, especially when everyone on the team participates, but a few choose otherwise? And I know that Zoom is taking a lot out of us, right? It's exhausting to be on Zoom calls over and over and over again. And it can cause a lot of anxiety in some people. So I wanted to throw this question out there because I hear this a lot, and you all might as well. Anybody want to take this?
I know with personal experience, I'll take this. Thank you for the question, Kimberly. It is one of those things that everyone feels very strongly about, but leaving that space to say, if you are not in the space, if you don't have on your makeup today, if you feel like today is winning and you're not, you have the freedom not to share your space. You don't have to be present visually for us to still get that support. And I think really being transparent and vulnerable in all of those spaces and kind of just putting it out there so that everyone can hear it. We're used to being face to face. And so really vocalizing and communicating those things verbally helps to put everyone on the same page.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to that, you know, I call it a rebuttal presumption that everyone will be on video. So the default is video and on, and I'm, you know, as I was before, very transparent with the challenges that I'm living in and letting people see them. But also, like you said, Michele, you know, making it okay for people to not be as well.
I haven't tried this yet, but I was thinking about saying certain meetings we would do by Zoom, as we have been doing so, and then maybe select other meetings that don't have to be visual, because I know it puts extra stress on all of us, and maybe we could do those certain videos, but telephonically, the old-fashioned way, and so we would still see each other, you know, enough time, but not every time.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. I heard of one person was telling me that she has been doing, I don't know if you all have heard of the Pomodoro method, which is 25 minutes on and 5 minutes off. And it's a way that you can also use in your work, right? To focus on something for 25 minutes and take 5 minutes off. She's been doing it with her teams for video. So if they have to do a video call, she'll say, we're going to be on video for 25 minutes. And then I want you to all shut your video off for 5 minutes, and then another 25 minutes, and then you're off for 5 minutes. And that way it kind of breaks it up a bit. But yeah, definitely hearing a lot about Zoom overload. And there are some really, really good articles out there right now about why it's so exhausting, so much more exhausting to be in a Zoom meeting than it is to be in an in-person meeting. So super fascinating. Okay, so we're at time. I hate cutting this conversation off because it's been so interesting and wonderful. And I want to thank all of you. Anybody have a last thought or comment that they want to say? Anything? All right. So thank you to both Michelle's, both Chris's, and Kimi, to everybody watching online. This has been recorded. It'll be on our Raben Group YouTube page. Please check out all of these wonderful organizations: Everytown Survivors Network, the Wendt Center, namely.com, the Trevor Project, and ProBar. They are doing amazing work with some populations that really need them right now. So I thank you all for sharing your time today and your expertise. And let's go build some resilient organizations. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.